Here at the Life Live Better podcast, we are true believers in the quality of Anchor by Spotify. We have been using Anchor since we first started our podcast, and now that we're halfway through our second season, we cannot imagine recording this podcast without it. Anchor has tools that allow you to record and then edit your podcast right from your computer or even your phone. When hosting on Anchor, you can distribute your podcast on all the listening platforms, like even Spotify and Apple. It's everything you need to make your podcast, and you can find it all in one place. But best of all, and oh so necessary when you're first starting out, it is completely free. So give it a try. Go download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm right now and get started. Hi, this is Paula.
And I'm Joseph, and you're listening to Life Lived Better.
Welcome to another episode of Life Lived Better. How are you, Joseph?
I'm doing good. I'm doing really good. It's been a busy Monday, had a good weekend, and glad to be here recording this today. And how about you? How was your weekend?
Good. I visited family. I was telling you before we started recording, I'm meeting with my aunt and we're doing like a family history. It's the
Nice.
second time I've had the opportunity to sit down with her. I mean, of course, we've met many, many times before. I've had conversation, she's been in my life forever, but we just started kind of making a written history of our family, and she's kind of going over all the people she remembers, their birth dates, and just kind of little
Nice.
tidbits and stuff, and I love doing that.
That's awesome. My dad was really into that for a while, like the genealogy, and he had started this whole binder that was just crammed full of history with the family, and it was really neat.
It's amazing to know, it's amazing to have. For me, and I've done this before, I did it before with my mother and another aunt, this my aunt who's doing it with me now, her sister, years ago. My goodness, it was, well, before I had a child. I mean, 25, 30 years ago. And what it did for me was like when they gave me some of the juicy details, the stuff you don't have on documented, it helped me realize a lot about like, okay, that makes sense because this thing happened. Like you have Uncle Tom who doesn't come to this gathering because Aunt Gertrude,
Oh
and
yeah,
that
the
kind of
politics
stuff.
of it all.
Exactly. It was just like,
Mhm.
oh, and when people would, when you get down to it, it like makes sense. Like that's why I did that, or that's why that's in the history, or it's just all like a breath of fresh air.
That's really cool.
It is.
It's neat that she's willing to sit down and kind of go through all that with you.
Oh yeah, she's amazing. She's just been one of my favorites my whole life. So she just got the best personality. Funny. Oh,
Yeah,
funny. Yeah.
that's awesome. I love to just hear old stories, and my parents were talking about how they met this weekend, and it
Oh.
was just sweet to kind of listen to them. And my mom's at that point where she's kind of forgetting people, but she's kind of forgetting my dad, or she does forget my dad. But this weekend she was telling me, we were sitting by ourselves, and she was telling me, she's like, this man, I wasn't sure about him at first, but he's just the sweetest, kindest, most loving, will do
Oh.
anything in the world for me. Like she just has found this, newfound kind of appreciation for
Mm-hmm.
him. And
That's amazing.
it was a good weekend. She was in a good place, and her memory seemed pretty decent. Her words seemed okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to understand what she was saying, which is always a plus.
That's
So,
amazing because we're not there when our parents meet, and when
hmm
they have that little spark and everything for the first time. And by the time we come along, sometimes they've kind of already moved past that and they're just managing a house and a
right.
family. And we don't get to see that all the time. So that's pretty neat to hear
Yeah.
that. Well, what have we got on the agenda today?
So today we're going to be talking a little bit about boundaries, what they
Oh.
are, how to set them, what it looks like when you need to set one. So got
Mm.
to covering a lot of ground.
Yeah, tough, tough. I did some research about what a boundary is, but in my mind, and when I talk to clients, I always think first like a boundary is something that sets a limit.
Mm-hmm.
And I always think of like a fence. Like, many of us have fences in our backyard. And part of the reason I have a fence in my backyard is because I have an animal and I want to keep him in. But there are some people I want to keep out. And so if a fence in my backyard does that, and I always think of that and use that as an example of a boundary with clients.
Yeah,
What I found, like a definition, like if you look at dictionary, it is a limit. It's a rule. It's something that we personally create. What's reasonable for us to keep us safe. And it is like our rule for what tells other people how to behave around us, how to a line that we set physically or emotionally that tells other people not to cross.
very good. I agree with that definition. I think the only thing I would add to that, or I guess not even add to that, but like my thinking when it comes to boundaries and the way I generally describe them is that it's basically, like you said, a want, a limit, something somebody's doing is causing a reaction that doesn't feel good or triggers some kind of emotion that maybe isn't warranted for the situation. So that's a sign that something's happening that you need to set a boundary. So a boundary is basically kind of pointing that out, then saying what it is you think needs to happen instead of the way they're treating you or the way they're handling that particular issue. And then a realistic consequence of if this doesn't stop, this is the consequence of
Mhm.
the action, right?
I think that goes real well with that saying I've heard so many times that we teach people how to treat us.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone's
Absolutely.
doing something that we don't like how it feels, to say you have to change that, in order to interact with me, it needs to be this way.
Right.
And of course, people can always say, then I don't want to interact with you.
Yep, you get to make the choice when
Hmm.
somebody sets a boundary. But I think something that's really important as part of setting a boundary is understanding that it feels uncomfortable. It feels, sometimes like you're hurting someone's feelings. And I always say, if you're hurting someone's feelings in order to take care of yourself, then it's okay. If
Hmm.
you're hurting someone's feelings just to be mean, not okay.
Hmm. I've often heard people say if it upsets someone when you set a boundary, it's usually confirmation that the boundary was needed.
Yes, I would agree with that. Some of the stuff that I found when it talks about like how do you know if you need to set a boundary, one of the things that I thought was interesting here on the list, number one, is if you're feeling when you have a conversation with somebody or something happens, somebody enters your personal space or there's just maybe some conversation that you're uncomfortable with, but if it triggers anger, rage, complaining, whining, feeling threatened, victimized, these are all things that are kind of clues that there's a boundary that needs to be established there.
So, what makes boundaries important? Why do we need them?
I think we need them because it's important it's something that's needed in order to take care of ourselves. It's something that when we get triggered with different emotions like anger or rage or, just feeling threatened, those are things that, we don't at least I don't want to have those kinds of responses on a regular basis or on any kind of consistent basis. And so, setting a boundary helps limit those kind of emotions that maybe you don't need to deal with, you don't need to feel, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I know we experience kind of the world in a couple of different ways. We experience them in our feeling, our body, our thinking, and our behavior. And I think there are boundaries in all of those places that are necessary.
Absolutely. And I think when I think of boundaries and kind of where we need them the most or where they show up the most or where you have to establish them the most, I often think of relationships
Absolutely.
because when you're in a relationship, you're kind of combining lives, you may be moving in together, you're merging things, and as a result, there's gonna be some things that are uncomfortable and some things that maybe you don't mesh well. And so you have to, I always think of leaving the clothes on the floor kind of situations, with couples. Like that's something that legitimately is an issue for some people, that you don't hang your clothes up when you take them off, or you just leave them laying on the floor instead of putting them, in the basket. You put them next to the basket or on top of the basket.
You think
Like,
about that and moving in together, how many people are behave in such different ways
hmm
like that. And if you've got a throw the clothes on the floor person versus a you always hang them up person, whoa.
yeah. So I've learned one of the greatest things to make a relationship successful is having your own closets.
Are you a hanger upper or a floor thrower?
I'm a hanger upper.
Awesome. Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, my son was just talking to me about that, about like there's a friend in their friend group who leaves dishes in the sink. And when they come over, they're like, hey, do you have any cups? Probably in the sink dirty.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, no, no, don't ever move in with them.
Yeah. Yeah. That's one of the things that bugs me is dishes like overnight. So usually in the morning when I'm making coffee, if there's anything that happened to get left behind, occasionally that's kind of what I'm doing, is cleaning and straightening. But so,
And yeah, and then you move your life in with a person who leaves dishes in the sink overnight. Lots of conversations happen. Lots of
hmm
conversations, negotiation, boundaries happen at that point. So how do you handle it? What do you do?
what is there's a sentence that we use in counseling, and it's something that's really easy to kind of identify what the
Mhm.
problem is, what the emotion is, what the solution is. Do you
Yeah,
remember that
I
sentence?
do. If when you blank, I feel blank, and what I need from you is blank. Can I get that?
So when you leave your clothes on the floor, I feel angry and I need you to put the clothes on the basket, or put the clothes in the basket, or hang your clothes up. The only part that's missing to me, again, is the consequence, because
Hmm.
for whatever reason, I think that's an important piece of setting a boundary.
I agree. I mean, because I mean, so you get angry when I put my clothes on the floor. What about what of it? You know?
Right. This is a conversation I find myself having regularly, that, when you just get mad and yell at someone, it's easier to just put up with somebody yelling at you occasionally than changing a behavior that you have,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. And especially when you don't always know what the behavior is. I hear people sometimes say they would say the problem here is they're sloppy, they're messy,
hmm
which means nothing. I don't
Right.
understand what sloppy and messy means to you.
Right.
You know, so the important piece there is real specific. Dishes in the sink, clothes on the floor.
Yeah. And also equally as important is the solutions, not only what you think the solution is, but an agreed upon solution,
Yeah,
right?
because why do you get your way? And it's
Right.
like so I don't hang clothes up. Why should I become a hanger upper just because we've moved in together?
And to me, that kind of sounds more like a limit to me. And I know limit is in the definition of a boundary, but I feel like there's kind of a difference between the boundary and the limit. Again, the limit being like, this is something I don't like. A boundary being, this is something I don't like, and here's what needs to change. Here's a consequence. Does that
Hmm.
make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think it does.
Yeah.
I think it does.
So, thinking about realistic consequences in group, when I teach this, we have an episode of Everybody Loves Raymond that we show, and it really, like, it's the pilot episode, it's the first episode ever, and it really sets up like the family dynamic and the lack of boundaries that
Yeah.
they have. And then
Yeah.
towards the end, they kind of go into establishing some boundaries. And so things like, when you're setting a consequence, not saying things like never and ever, because never and never are things that you're probably not going to hold strong to. And that's the thing about a consequence, is that it needs to be realistic. It needs to be
Hmm.
something that you're actually going to stick with, because if you don't, then the person just learns that they just have to, again, just kind of put up with you getting mad every
Hmm.
once in a while.
Yeah. I'm totally in favor of eliminating those words from my vocabulary
Mm,
altogether. The
yeah,
never, ever, always. I just they are not true. They
right,
can't be true.
right.
And problematic language when you're trying to navigate relationships.
hmm
That's a
Absolutely.
so if we're talking about the clothes on the floor versus the hanging up the clothes, how would you use that? I mean, like, how would you go through that whole what's the complete conversation look like?
So to me, just kind of again pointing out what the problem is. The problem is that the clothes are being left on the floor. And maybe like, sometimes you might need to give some background as to why this is a problem. It's a problem because when I take a shower, the water gets out and gets all over the clothes that are on the floor. Or when I get up in the middle of the night to go to the restroom, I trip over your pants that are laying in the middle of the floor. So sometimes, when you're talking about a problem, you need to, especially when it's a couple or it involves another person, sometimes you have to put it in a way that they actually can understand why it's a problem and it's not just you griping or complaining about something. So that may be part of it.
So what's the reason I can't say you get up late every morning and you're always looking for your damn pants? If you hang them up instead of laying them on the floor, you wouldn't be late for work.
Well, how would you respond to that?
Oh, well, I don't know.
Yeah, probably not well.
I'm a
So,
hanger-upper. I don't have to worry about that, do I? I hear
so
people get
that's
attacked like that a lot in relationships, and that starts a war that never gets solved.
Well, and I think that happens because people don't establish boundaries. I think what's happening in that scenario is that things have gotten so out of control, or they've gotten to a point where you have so many resentments built up that the smallest thing sets off that whole experience, that whole, fight, argument, war, whatever you want to call it. And if you just start establishing these boundaries, a little bit at a time, then the resentments start to go away, the issues start to go away, you start to communicate more effectively, you start feeling more love for one another than, anger towards one another. So there's a lot of good things that come from boundaries, but getting in the habit of setting them and understanding that it takes practice and it takes time to kind of master them, I think is, probably one of the hardest parts of learning to set boundaries.
Absolutely. I've also seen people, I've probably been a people that have like, I would go behind someone, pick up the pants, hang them up because look how nice this is.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm doing this nice thing for you each day. I'm picking it up and hanging it because it means so much to me. Look at how great this is. And then a year or two into hanging up after you blow up
Right.
because don't you even recognize how much work I do when the pants on the floor was never even a big deal to the person to begin with. They don't care if they're
Right.
hanging up or on the floor. So if I don't communicate to you what I want, need, expect, and just assume then all kinds of resentments can build from that.
Yes, they do.
And how is that, like we talked about it being not just like a physical limit, but like a emotions as well. How does the boundary work there? What kind of a situation would it be where we know like emotionally someone's violating our boundaries?
I guess just when you feel like you're getting, like, for lack of better words, triggered.
Uh, how about body, I mean, we have to protect our body from unwanted advances, unwanted touch, unwanted,
Mm-hmm.
and that isn't always actual physical. Sometimes people say like, baby, you look good in that, whatever. I don't experience that, but I've heard that happen in the world. Um, so I know you can feel violated in your body with a person without a person ever even touching you.
Very
Mm,
true.
don't want to hurt people's feelings. You want to accept that it's maybe just how they compliment, but it feels gross.
Yeah, and I think if something feels gross, then again, that's a feeling, that's one of those uncomfortable things that's telling you on some level something's not okay. And so figuring out what that is and then how to address it.
I think about like sexual harassment in the workplace. You have to be around those people, your coworkers. That's why there are rules about, not saying those things to people that you work with.
Right.
That, so that's so everybody's on the same page. Everybody can feel safe in that environment because there are rules that you're not supposed to, so people can feel like they have they have their self-respect, that
Mm-hmm.
they're shown respect by others and that everyone acts in a professional manner. And sometimes people have to be explained to what professional means.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why those rules exist in workplaces.
And like any rule, I mean, there are oftentimes rules that we don't like, that we don't understand, but if it's a rule, then you need to follow it, right? in a relationship, hopefully the rules can be compromises, can be things that you both arrive at and kind of can either agree upon or compromise on. But when it comes to like a work environment, the rules are the rules, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they seem black and white.
Right, mostly. So when you're working on setting these boundaries, the thing that comes up the most for me is just that discomfort that comes along because you're basically pointing out to someone something that they're doing that you don't like that's making you feel a certain way, not a good way. And so you're calling them out on a behavior, and most people don't like to be called out on behaviors. So it may get met with resistance, it may get met with hostility. There's a lot of ways that it can be received, but I always try to remember that that's not my responsibility. Like how they receive it isn't my responsibility. It's my responsibility to put it out in a way that is authentic and real to me, and follow those guidelines that this is the situation, the behavior, this is how I feel about it, and here's what I want to happen.
Yeah. And setting the boundaries is scary whenever you first start doing them.
Mm-hmm.
From my experience, and especially if you're interacting with someone pretty unhealthy, saying, when you do that, this is how I feel, and I
Mm-hmm.
want you to stop. Because I've had experiences with really sick people where they can turn that around, like, and that's about you. I'm not doing
Mm-hmm.
anything wrong. What I'm doing, I'm just complimenting you.
Right.
God, you don't even want, what's wrong with you that you can't? And I think that's a perfect red flag for you were right on by setting that
Mm.
boundary. Because
Yeah.
because that person is real unhealthy, and just hearing a healthy boundary is freaking them out
Yes,
because they're
absolutely
going to say,
agree.
you're the problem. You're the problem.
But a boundary is about taking care of yourself. And like we talked about in our last episode on self-esteem, if you don't have great self-esteem, then probably you may not know how to take care of yourself. So,
Hmm.
in this case, like this is something that kind of builds nicely onto that because when you start working on bettering your self-esteem, you have to start setting boundaries
Yeah.
as part of maintaining that. So, learning to take care of yourself, not worrying about how it's received, not worrying about what happens, just putting it out there, putting out what your need is,
Hmm. Yeah,
trusting the process.
absolutely. And now, are boundaries different based on who you're interacting with?
I think so. I think your boundary is going to be very different with an employer than with your mom,
Hmm.
right?
Right. You have some friends that have a key to your house, and when they come over, they may open your refrigerator. That just may be y'all's relationship. And then
Hmm.
you may have some that if they were over for the first time, y'all are just getting to know each other. They get up, open your refrigerator. You're like, weird.
Yeah, yeah,
We're not quite to that part, to the refrigerator opening up part.
right.
There are
Yeah,
people,
that's
there are some people that have that. It's like, hey, my home is your home. Anything, use whatever, don't have to ask. And there are other people that are like, kind of, their home is their domain, and they want to kind of be in charge of how those interactions go, which you'd think is that's kind of, well, that's not a big deal, is it? It's a big deal that, in a person's space,
hmm
that we hear how they want us to treat that space. How they want us to treat them.
I agree with that. So some tips and things that you might expect when you're setting boundaries or things that you might experience when you need to set a boundary. So we have a
Mhm.
couple of things on our list here. The first one I think we've touched on briefly, but if you're feeling anger, rage, complaining, whining, feeling threatened, victimized, these are clues that you need to set a boundary around a behavior.
And whenever you have identified that you need to set a boundary or some sort of limit with somebody, it's important that you do it clearly, and you do it as much as possible without anger kind of coming through, and in as few words as possible, just very specific and clear.
Oh, that's so good because
Mm.
lots of times when we're angry, we try to problem solve and accomplish things. And when you're angry, it's like you're sending data, you're not receiving data. So the likelihood of that information sticking is slim.
Hmm. And when you're like real apologetic about, I'm so sorry. I know you, this isn't about you. This is about me. I know that, you're used to doing this and people don't hear you. They
Mm-hmm.
don't. So I think the concise part, the very clear part.
Yeah, agree. And I think that's where that sentence comes in super handy because it very
Yes.
quickly identifies situation, the emotion,
Mhm.
consequence.
Yes, I love that sentence. I feel when, because, and what I need from you.
The next one on the list is just remembering that you can't simultaneously set a limit with someone and also take care of their feelings. And I think we talked a little bit about this. Like when you set a boundary, you're probably going to hurt some feelings because again, you're pointing out things that people don't want pointed out or things that are people are doing that when you point them out, it makes them uncomfortable,
Hmm.
right?
When you're a
Something I'm
people
doing.
pleaser,
Yes.
when you have low self-esteem,
Yeah.
that's hard.
Just understanding that they may be hurt, they may be angry, and they may be disappointed in what you say. But again, it's just your job to deliver it as cleanly, as, clearly, and as concise as possible.
Hmm.
Three
Because if you
C's.
don't,
I just dubbed that the three
clear,
C's.
concise, that's really hard. I think a question you have to ask yourself when you're about to set a boundary, when you're ready to set a boundary, is this is what I need to do. And if I can't set the boundary, or if they can't accept this as my boundary, can I live with this? I'm either gonna set the boundary, or I'm gonna just accept that they're gonna act this way and can't do anything about it.
Yep.
I'm gonna accept this behavior in my life.
And that's something you have to do sometimes, but I don't think you can do it if it compromises like your core values, your core belief system.
I
I think those are
truly
areas that
believe
we
that.
generally can't compromise in.
Yeah,
But you're
and
absolutely right. There's
mm,
always that possibility that it's not going to change.
yeah, and people that have low self-esteem, or people who are people pleasers, live with a lot of violated boundaries,
Hmm.
and I feel like my boundaries are more important than hurting someone's feelings or not.
Yeah. And
Mm.
understanding that the boundary will get tested, just like when you set a limit with a kid, like they're
Yeah.
going to push. They're going to push and see how far, how serious are you? How far can they push this?
Mhm.
Adults do the same thing. When you set a boundary, it's kind of like I always think when somebody sets a hot plate on the table and they say hot plate, and your instinct is to push that plate
Touch it. Is it really hot?
up a half an inch.
Yes.
Like doesn't make sense, but we do it. And not only do they not only do they get tested sometimes, it's not just about getting tested, but sometimes people are happy to actually respect your boundaries. Sometimes people are happy to hear like a solution to something, like they legitimately don't know that something that they're doing is upsetting you or bothering you,
Mhm.
and so they're happy to hear it, they're willing to make a change. And so boundaries aren't always bad, they're not always going to be scary and all of that.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's received really well, and those are times that you really have to like hold on to and celebrate because
Absolutely. I
yeah,
want to know if I love you and I'm doing something to bother you that much. I want you to tell me, because I don't want to do it.
right.
I don't want, because not all boundary violations are a result of me being unhealthy and rude or all that. Just like I do things a certain way and you want them a different way,
Hmm.
So sometimes I don't even know. And just you telling me may strengthen our relationship.
I always think of that little dialogue that I run through in my head when somebody says something that is upsetting or, hurtful to me. I always try to run through this dialogue of, does this person love me, care about me? And if the answer is yes, would they intentionally be trying to hurt me? Probably not. So what's another way I could take this information? Because I'm
Oh.
receiving it in a way that it's probably not intended to be received. So, when I kind of break it down into in those ways, it helps me sometimes kind of see it or hear it differently.
I like that. I like that a lot. That's probably why you tolerate me so well. Just like everything, just like all places, having a support system while you're setting boundaries, establishing boundaries, reinforcing your boundaries, it's so important to have other healthy people who you can turn to for them to say, "You're doing great. Yes, that's to be expected. You're doing the right thing. Don't let them push you. Don't let them come back. Don't let them violate that boundary again."
One of the last things on this kind of tips and things that you might expect is that, ultimately setting boundaries feel good. And I think, we've talked about the scariness of it and kind of the feelings that can come up, but it does feel good when you get to a point that you can set a boundary. You get good at setting the boundaries, you get consistent with them because all of those things are about taking care of yourself and, getting your needs met. And who
Mhm.
doesn't feel good when they're getting their needs met, right?
Exactly. Okay, so we've set the boundaries. Now, how do we maintain them? How do we keep making sure in the future they're intact?
Good question. So one of the things that you can do is just ask directly for what you want.
Mhm.
That shows to others that you know what it is that you want. You know what it is that basically needs to be addressed. You're clear, you're concise, you're calm. The three C's.
All right. And keep nurturing yourself, keep taking care of yourself. When you start setting boundaries, you'll feel this inner intuition. You'll know when someone is violating them, and then you can go right back through the setting them with new people.
And sometimes you have to set them over and over, right?
Mhm.
Like,
Mhm.
and sometimes we didn't talk about this, but sometimes you have to adjust like what the consequence is because you may set an unrealistic consequence and you may have to come back and revisit that when you realize it gets pushed to a point that you have to then enforce the consequence and you
Aha.
realize, oh, wait, I don't really feel comfortable with this, or I didn't really mean this, or this is
Mhm.
harder than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah,
So it is okay to reevaluate and change. You just don't want to be doing that all the time.
correct.
Try to be consistent.
Yeah, because if you don't follow through with the consequence, you're definitely sending a message.
Another way to maintain it is just making sure that you're being objective. You're able to, kind of understand others' behavior towards you and, not getting caught up in drama, getting caught up in back and forth and trying to explain your point, allowing them to kind of explain theirs, like that's important, but getting lost in all of that or getting to a point where you start getting angry or it starts getting about finger pointing or, when you do this, blah, 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 like just understanding that they're going to see things one way, you're going to see things one way. And the goal is to kind of get on the same page.
Mhm. Yeah. The next tip is important to what you said earlier about your core values, that we maintain a bottom line, that we have a bottom line limit on some things in our life, and that no one can violate those. And we keep clear on that, and we do really limit times that we allow anyone to violate those.
The last one on the list is basically change the focus and trust from others to yourself. So, again, setting a boundary is about identifying what our needs are. It's not about other people and what we want, to change about them. It's about like, this needs to change in order for me to feel better. And one thing that I find myself saying a lot when I talk about boundaries is that it may feel selfish, it may feel uncomfortable because you are talking about yourself and you are putting something out there that's, your need, and that's okay. Like that feeling is okay and it's valid, but, maintaining the focus and being sure that you're basically trying, I was going to say control, I hate to use the word control, but you're basically managing the situation and not letting it manage you.
Mhm. Yeah. And there is a big deal about trusting yourself, that these
Hmm.
boundaries are necessary, that these boundaries are legitimate, that I do have this normal human right, to
Hmm.
this limit in my life.
And, as far as like once you start setting these boundaries, you start to learn value, you start to learn trust, you start to listen to yourself, which those are all really good, powerful things.
Mhm.
What are some other things you feel from setting boundaries, like long-term results?
I think that it increases my self-esteem. This is who I am, I
Hmm.
mean, my boundaries are a part of that. It's like, this is what I will accept in my life. And the better I am with that, the better I feel about myself, the less I attract people into my life who want to violate my boundaries or the type of people that want something different than are my core values, needs, and wants. Because I recognize boundary violations pretty quickly now.
Mm-hmm.
And when I get into situations where I have given way too often, I think about that. I really think about it and go, okay, I see right away when I allowed someone to push me and I didn't say anything. I can go
Mm-hmm.
right back to the very first time it happened and see kind of a pattern. And it just, when I do that, I just let it happens less frequently because I'm so aware of it now.
Took you some time though,
It
right?
did. It did. For me, it's like whenever I'm a counselor and I do groups, the first time that client came into the group late, and the facility rule is you can't come into group more than 5 minutes after the group starts. Well, the first time I let that person in 10 minutes after group started, then they do it again,
Mm-hmm.
you know, then they do it a third time. There becomes a point in that process where it's my fault now.
Right. Right.
That's how I taught you. It's like my puppy, my puppy's still a puppy. I'm teaching him some things. I expect he does certain things. Well, if I hear him doing something or see him doing something that I don't like and I didn't want him to learn, I can look back to the fact that I've probably taught him to behave that way.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make
No, it makes
sense?
sense. It
Okay.
does. It does.
Uh,
And that's a great example about the group because in my practice, doing groups, having people pushing those boundaries, it is hard. It's hard to, not admit. It's easier now with Zoom because you just don't have to hit
yeah,
admit.
yeah,
But,
exactly.
you
Yep.
know, when, when we were coming in person, like you have to, like I would lock the door and someone would stand there and knock for 5 minutes. That's one of the rules that I go through when I'm signing people up is that if you're late and you arrive and the door is locked, do not knock. If the door is locked, that means it's too late to come in. So go home. You can call and leave
Mhm,
a voicemail if you would like. Occasionally the door would be unlocked and someone would walk in and just sit down. And then, you have to have a conversation. You don't
mhm.
want to stop the entire group to have that conversation. So sometimes it's just it's too late. Sometimes you give them an exception, but you're right. Like if you do that over and over, then you have just taught them it's okay to do that. And
Exactly.
that's on me.
Exactly.
That's on the person that's allowing it. And it's tough, like, especially in a group setting, because you have the other group members that are like, oh man, like you should let them, because it's like, and this is not, it's unhealthy. And like the whole point of this group is to learn limits and boundaries and, be accountable for our actions. And that's what I usually come back with is like, it's not okay. It's not an okay behavior.
You're teaching the whole group by your role modeling.
It's tough though. It's hard. It's hard to set those limits and those boundaries. But I will tell you, like most of the time when that happens, the behavior gets corrected pretty quickly.
There are professors that have these reputations of, they tell the students on the first day of class, and then it's in their syllabus, you cannot come into class after it starts. And then
Hmm.
they shame a person if they do. Like
Oh
they
wow.
walk into class and they stop the whole class and just watch the person. And I'm like, oh, well, you know what? If I ever saw that in a class as a student, I would never be late to that class, or I would not walk in if I were late to that class. I had a professor like that,
Hmm.
and I was not ever late.
Yeah, it's all done in goodwill, good faith, whatever you want to call it. That all this is about kind of correcting, making things better, and overcoming these issues that we again may be just happening on our side, like the other person may not have a clue, but by pointing it out and by giving them the opportunity to correct it, like it's potentially going to make a big shift, a big change in that relationship and that dynamic.
Without a doubt. We walk around with rules, but if we don't tell others what they are, we can't expect them to abide. And that, I think as a group facilitator, I think that's role modeled when somebody who's never ever been late to group is late to group and you let them in
Yeah.
because there's an exception because they've already shown you that, they've earned your trust.
Hmm. one of the things in our list here was that saying no is perfectly acceptable.
Mhm.
And I think what ties into that is, again, not like in that situation with a group. Sometimes I feel like when I let someone in late, like the other attendees are going to be like, well, why is he letting that person in when he didn't let the other person in? Especially when it happens on the same night,
Oh, yeah.
you know? But there's that feeling that I need to explain that. And part of being healthy and being, I don't know if you call it self-esteem or just having good boundaries, but you don't need to explain those things. You don't have to have a conversation around everything. Like, you don't need to explain why this is important to you. You just need to explain that it's a violation of some kind. It's
Mhm.
something that's making you uncomfortable. And
Yeah.
that's really it. Don't
Yeah.
you think? Or am I off
No,
on
I
that at
think
all?
you're correct. It's hard, I
Yeah.
think, if you aren't practiced at
Mm-hmm.
setting boundaries or saying no, it's real hard because
Yeah.
I've heard, no is a complete sentence. It's an
Yeah.
acceptable answer.
Put a period at the end of it.
Hmm.
Done. We
I
want to
think this
wrap
is
up.
fantastic. Great information. So, good challenge this week to think about that, where we need to set boundaries and maybe even trying it out.
And I think it's a natural kind of step from the self-esteem work that we were talking about last week. I think the more improvement you make in that area, the better the boundaries are going to be, and they just kind of like feed off one another.
Completely.
Well, thanks everybody for listening and joining us. And please don't forget to like and subscribe and share us with all your friends. And as always, don't forget that knowledge leads to a life lived better. Thank you for listening to Life Lived Better with Paula and Joseph.